Okay, welcome to On Board with the Candidates, where I'm going to pick one game per day, try to pick out some of the key elements of those games, and hopefully we can apply these things to our own games. For round two, I chose Fabiano Caruana playing Abasov. Caruana obviously being sort of the pre-tournament favourite and Abasov being the underdog. So we had an interesting game to look at where largely the theme of the game was knights v bishops, and this is something that comes up quite commonly in games of chess, and understanding the strategy of how to handle knight v bishop positions can really help us with our own game and improving our rating. So the game started with 1 e4. Abasov replied with the Sicilian, and Caruana played knight f3. So continuing with the opening rules, where you should sort of occupy the centre, and then bring your knights out, your bishops out, and get castled is what I always tell beginners. Okay, so Abasov again followed the opening rules. Knight c6, he brings his knight out, controlling the centre, and Fabi played bishop b5, which is a common reply, more strategic than the open Sicilian. This is one of his favourites, but it's particularly sort of useful when you're playing a weaker opponent to maybe play more strategically less sharp and give them more decisions to make if you're a better player, and you give your opponent more decisions to make rather than sharp forcing positions, and they're more likely to make a mistake. Abasov played e5, tightening his grip on that d4 square. However, there is the potential of sort of giving white this d5 square. In the future, he potentially could use that. So Caruana carried on playing very principled chess. He just castled, so it's only move 4. He's already got his king to safety and 2 of his minor pieces out. So this is what I like to see from my own students. So following the basics, getting that king safe early on. Abasov, there's a few options instead of castling. So one of them is to play c3. The idea with c3 is you eventually want to play d4, also preventing a knight from hopping into this square. Also gives your bishop some breathing space in case it gets sort of chased on that queen side, so that it can sort of hop back to a4 and then to c2 if you do want to preserve that piece. So that's a different way of playing. One thing that white can't do is he can't win a pawn here by taking on c6. Black would respond by taking, and now if you just try and win this pawn, you look one more step ahead and you'll see that you have 3 loose pieces here. So the knight on e5 is loose, this pawn is loose, and this pawn on g2 is loose. This is another thing I point out to anyone I'm teaching. Always be aware of the loose pieces on the board. If there's 2 or more, and there's possibilities for you or your opponent to attack 2 or more loose pieces at the same time, and it becomes very difficult, sometimes impossible, to defend all the loose pieces. So black would have the choice here of either going queen g5, attacking these 2 loose pieces, and winning one of them, or alternatively playing queen d4, attacking these 2 loose pieces on e5 and e4, therefore winning the pawn back and with some interest. Okay. So be aware of loose pieces. So castles, bishop d6 Abasov played here. So an odd looking move. Again, the more advanced sort of beginners might sort of think, this doesn't look right because it's blocking in this d6 pawn and not allowing the bishop out. What Abasov is banking on is that white will take here and then allow this bishop out, basically. Or alternatively, at some point, for example, playing a6 b5 and allowing the bishop to come out to this diagonal instead. Now, as I mentioned, loose pieces, you have to be a little bit careful of them. And this bishop oddly, on d6 is loose. There is nothing defending it. And this potentially could be tactical liability in the future. Okay, so for Fabi played d3, suggesting that he wants a quieter, more strategic game. Now, despite Black's really tight grip of this d4 square, he's literally defending it with 3 pieces. White can actually play d4 in this position due to this loose bishop on e6. If Black takes, then you can just play c3, and because that bishop is loose on d6, you win the pawn back, and with a lot of control over the centre. Yeah, there's no way of sort of adequately defending this d4 pawn. And with this king being still in the centre, it's a bit dangerous to let the centre open up. Okay, actually, if knight takes, White can just ignore the fact that he's a pawn down and just play quietly. A game Caruana and Nakamura just carried on. White just played bishop c4, went after that f7 pawn and just sort of played normal moves, ignoring the fact that he was a pawn down. And that's because he's got a very tight grip of this d5 square, and all of White's pieces are better than Black's pieces. So I would not suggest this for sort of a beginner level. Don't be just giving pawns away for nothing without sort of understanding the strategy. It takes deep study to understand something like this, that you have enough compensation for your pawn. However, this was Caruana Nakamura. Caruana went on to win this game. So there's adequate compensation for the pawn. As I mentioned at the start, when you're playing someone a little bit weaker, sometimes you just want to give them lots of decisions to make. You don't want to give them 1 or 2 decisions to make. A quiet move like d3 gives Black lots and lots of options, and if you're a weaker player, you're more likely to make a mistake. Okay. Abasov carried on, developing, sticking to the basics, knight f6, and Caruana again stuck to the basics, bringing in some knight out. So I'd be very pleased if one of my students played like this. Knights are out, bishops are coming out, he's castled. It's all very, very good so far. Okay. Abasov carried on, castled, and interesting move now by Caruana, h3. What is the point of h3? Okay, so h3, I would say, is a prophylactic move. So prophylactic means you're kind of preventing something before it has happened. So it's preventing 2 things. One thing very long in the future, potentially in an endgame. It's preventing him from getting back rank checkmated. So when these pawns are all in a line here, the king has no escape square. So potentially, say 30, 40 moves from now, it's preventing him from getting checkmated. It's giving him an escape square for his king. The other thing it indicates is that he's probably going to play bishop takes knight at some point, and then he doesn't want this bishop to come to g4, pinning the knight against the queen. So this h3 move pretty much says, I'm going to take your knight, I don't want your bishop coming out to this g4 square. Different ways to play strategically in this position is you could have played something like a4. A4 would be a way to play if you wanted to keep your bishop pair. So it gives you a square potentially to drop back to, so that if the bishop gets chased, it can pop back to this square, and it's safe, keeps it on the board and on this very nice diagonal. Another way to play a different form of strategy, so there's 3 strategies that you can adopt in this position, is to play bishop g5. And this was to indicate more of a fight for this d5 square. Squares are very, very good for knights if they cannot be attacked by a pawn, and since the e5 pawn and the c5 pawn have already gone past this d5 square, then the d5 square is very, very inviting for a knight to sit on. If you could eliminate all the pieces that can take a knight on that square, so that's this knight, and this bishop, then the knight on d5 would be a very, very good piece. So bishop g5 sort of says, right, I'm going to get rid of that first knight at least. The game could continue something like this: a6, bishop takes, queen takes, knight d5, and then bishop retreats. And you can see now in this point why a4 was a good idea in this other previous strategy, because you can't keep hold of this bishop. So knight a5, c3, and takes it off. So black retains this white squared bishop with the possibility of getting rid of this knight. If he did not have this white squared bishop on c8, then he probably strategically would be in a lot of trouble. A knight on d5 would be worth way more than 3 points that we learn as a beginner. If there's no pawns, bishops or knights that can take it, then often it can be better than a rook. Okay, so Caruana decided to play h3, indicating that after a6 he was just going to chop this knight off. And now this gives us a position where we have black with the bishop pair and white with a knight, okay, or one knight and a bishop. Now, strategically, it's really, really important to understand these kind of positions. They come up really often, and the person that treats their knight or their bishop better often comes out on top strategically. Now, when you ask beginners, or even some very strong players, what position do bishops favour? And they would often say open positions, right? So the bishop's going to be better in open positions, the knight's going to be better in closed positions. And that's not something that I would say. Basically, I think knights are better when they have squares to sit on. If they have really nice squares to sit on, then the knight is often better than that bishop. Okay, so there's lots of little intricacies, but generally knights are good when they have good squares to sit on. In this position here, does the knight have any good squares to sit on? Not loads, but potentially we can create some in the future. If I was identifying some nice squares for knights, I'd be looking at c4 potentially, f5, and possibly b6. Okay, so what we want from a nice knight square is where it cannot be attacked easily. So on b6 it can't be attacked by a pawn. However, it's a little bit out of the way. We do want the square to be close to where the action is. We want it to be actually doing something useful on that square. A knight on b6 would be sort of out of the game. So that's why that square is not ideal. Fabi immediately goes and tries to put his knight on one of these squares with knight h4, indicating it's going to come into this f5 square. Despite this square being quite easy to attack with the pawn, with g6 for example, g6 is such a weakening move, allowing lots of dark squared holes around that king. If you don't really want to play it. So that's why this f5 square is really, really good for a knight. Abasov carried on with rook e8, and rather than hopping in to f5, you always have to check out forcing moves. And black probably would have whipped this knight off and then played e4 himself, opening up that bishop. It's not a great piece here, but after e4, it's a pretty good piece on a really nice diagonal. So this sort of problem tells us why Caruana played his next move, queen f3. So, for example, if the game continued bishop e6 and then knight f5 takes, this e4 square now is this e4 move is stopped. The bishop on d6 is not very good, and white would eventually think about playing something like g4, g5, and winning this e4 square for his knight himself. Okay, you can imagine a knight sitting there in the future, targeting this c5 weakness, putting pressure on the bishop, and also helping a potential attack on the king side. It's a fantastic square. So this queen f3 is sort of setting this up in the future. Abasov didn't want the knight hopping into f5, so he played g6 himself. Now, this knight h4 move has provoked g6, and now there are lots of dark squared holes around black's king, which Fabi immediately starts to exploit with bishop g5, pinning that knight against the queen. A threat that needed to be responded to by bishop e7, and Fabi slides his queen over, again targeting those dark squares, supporting that bishop on g5, and also keeping an eye on this weak c5 pawn. In addition, so it's a multi-purpose move, it's doing lots of things at the same time. We always aim to try and do lots of things with each one of our moves in chess. If we can achieve more than one thing on every move, then we're onto a winner. In addition, this queen sliding across allows this f pawn to potentially go to f4, opening lines against that king where the dark squares have already been weakened. Black decided to try and trade off the bishops, knight h5. Trading off the bishops also, the dark squared bishops, means that this f4 square is not so protected, and potentially he can pop his own knight onto f4, which potentially can be difficult to remove if it wasn't for this knight on c3 being able to come back to e2. Now white just says, okay, my job is done. This knight on h4's job is done. It's created all those dark squared holes. There's no more work for it to do from the h4 square, so it's going to relocate, possibly to this lovely c4 square that we pointed out a long time ago. So if you remember, like at the start of this sort of sequence, I said f5 and c4 were good squares for knights. So it threatened to go into f5, provoked some weakness. It's sort of heading towards this c4 square potentially now. So yeah, we've still got a knight versus a bishop scenario here. So if the knight's side doesn't create squares for themselves, okay, if the knights don't have squares, the bishop is going to be better long term in an end game, especially if there's pawns on both sides of the board. Knights take a very long time to hop from one side of the board to the other, compared to a bishop that can do it in one move. So if white doesn't succeed in creating squares for these knights and holes, then the bishop is going to be better in the long term. Okay, so black is a little bit tired of babysitting this pawn on c5 and decides to protect it. Okay, so Fabi goes a3. Interesting move that he could have done or considered instead. And you should always look for forcing moves. Okay, so whenever there are loose pieces on the board, whenever you have an option to check your opponent's king, whenever you have options of threats, you should calculate them. Okay, so this b6 pawn is loose, right? There's nothing defending it, so you have to calculate moves that attack it if possible. So knight a4 would attack this pawn. And if it's defended by the rook, then actually there is this idea of potentially going b4. So this means that this pawn is attacked 3 times on c5. It's only defended twice, so something has to be done about it. If he captures here, you can take on b6, getting your pawn back. So it's a very temporary pawn sacrifice. And now, if you remember me saying you have to create squares for your knights. If the knights don't have any squares to sit on, they're no good. So you have created lots of squares, lots of weak squares on this queen side that the knights can sit on. And you've improved this c4 square. Now this c4 square cannot be attacked by a pawn. So this knight, when it hops around to this square, potentially will be a lot stronger. And then we can start exploiting the weaknesses on the queen side. Okay. Again, strategically, as I said, when you're playing against someone weaker, you don't really want to be forcing things. You want to be giving them lots and lots of options so that they can go wrong. This was quite a forcing sequence, so Fabi potentially decided not to do it because of that and went for a more quiet a3. Now, even though a3 is quiet, or more quiet looking, it actually carries a nasty positional threat because it strengthens the threat of knight a4 that we previously just talked about. Let's imagine that black just waits to move with king g7. He can go knight a4, and after takes b4, takes. The strength of the strength of this threat is bigger, because he can collect the pawn back, and then the a6 pawn is going to be really, really weak in the long term. Okay, and the c6 pawn is going to be really weak. So it sort of strengthens the threat of knight a4, b5. So something has to be done about it. So Abasov's response was quite committal. He chose to go b5, preventing knight a4. However, it does weaken the c5 square considerably. It cannot now be defended by a pawn. It's also on a dark square, so it can't be defended by his bishop. So this is a potential problem for the future. It also gives us the potential of sitting a knight on c5 in the future. If a knight can sit on c5, it's going to be really, really strong because it can't be attacked by a pawn or a bishop. So Caruana now has provoked weaknesses on the king's side and the queen's side, and he just quietly retreats his knight to a2. These quiet moves are really, really powerful when you're playing a weaker player because it gives them so many options. They can do lots of things. They're not being forced to do anything, and therefore they're more likely to make a mistake, whether tactical or strategic. This knight on e2 is preventing the knight coming into f4 as well. So f6 was played, and then another, again, a very quiet retreating move, knight d2, potentially eyeing b3, or potentially opening the position up with f4 at some point. Abasov played bishop e6, f4 was played to try and open the position up, and the knights got swapped off, and the f-file is now open for business for white. Okay, so he has spent sort of 10 moves or so creating weaknesses in black's camp. So we have a weakness here, we have a weakness here, we have some dark squared weaknesses around the king, and now he's just going to continue to improve his position. Okay, so white has weaknesses to play for, but he's not going in for the kill. He's still going to continue improving his position. Well, I tell my students, sort of, look, which pieces of yours are being lazy, which are not doing anything. So this rook on a1 is not doing anything. This queen on e3 could be improved as well. So he first plays queen f2, gets it out of the potential x-ray attacks on the e-file, while adding weight to attacking this f-pawn, also hinting at potentially coming out this side. So Abasov had to defend this pawn on f6. He played rook f8, rook f1 came, so now this is being attacked 3 times. It's only been defended twice, so he needed to add some weight to the defense of this f-pawn. King g7. Now a very interesting move by Caruana was played. He played b4. Now, how can you get away with b4? It's the b4 square is being attacked twice by the c5 pawn and the queen on e7. Well, the point is distraction. Okay, so this is a tactical thing. It's a tactical theme. This f6 pawn is being defended 3 times. It's being attacked 3 times. And if you could distract one of black's pieces away, then it means you could take it. It's quite an important pawn because it opens up lots of dark squares for potential knight infiltrations. Also, the f6 square is so close to black's king that if the pawn was to be lost or removed, then this king might be in danger. Okay, so black is forced to take on b4 at least once. If he took on b4 again, this f6 pawn would drop, and when the queen comes back to defend, e5 can be played, and the whole theme of the game so far has been white trying to create squares for his knight, and now he's got a fantastic square on c5, he's got a fantastic square on d6 or f6, all dark squares, and none of these can be defended by a pawn. So the knight, when hopping into one of these squares, would probably be worth more than a rook, and he would have achieved his strategic aims of creating a really nice square for a knight to sit on. Therefore, also opening the a-file has weakened this a6 pawn. It's now a backward pawn, meaning it's behind the pawn that it potentially could defend it on an open file. So this is a weakness which Abasov prophylactically defends with his rook. Remember, prophylaxis means defending a threat before sort of stopping something from happening before it happens. Okay, and Fabi responds with his own prophylactic move. Okay, So I think it's a very sneaky prophylactic move. He plays King H1. Now, beginners might not understand why on earth would you play such a move. What's it doing? Well, for starters, it's waiting. Okay, it's giving black another go. It's saying, go on and have another go yourself. Secondly, that sort of indicates that he knows what black's plan is and he wants him to do it. The second thing it's doing is it's getting the king off this diagonal. So the point is that things like queen a7 would not swap the queens off because the queen can now move. Wouldn't be pinned to the king, and it's preventing checks in the future. Okay, so again, it's a prophylactic move. It's preventing things from happening before they happen, basically. Now, the plan that Caruana thought that Abasov was going to play was a5, and it's obvious that he wanted him to do this. And I think the reason is really clever. And again, it's on this knight versus bishop theme. If he was to take this pawn back, so he's eliminated his weakness of this backward a pawn on a6, then this very clever idea of playing e5, exploiting the pin on the f file, would have happened, threatening this pawn on f6 4 times and forcing him to come forward. He would then again exploit this pin on the f file. As if takes, then this rook would drop off. And now the theme of the game so far, as I said, White has been trying to create squares for this knight, and he's got these lovely squares for the knight to sit on. So this king h1 move, very, very sneaky, but and you may not guess it, but it's on the theme of on the surface you wouldn't guess it, but it's on the theme of creating squares for this knight to sit on. So Abasov decides not to take this pawn back, plays c5, and White just tries to keep it now. It's a passed pawn. In an endgame, it's potentially very dangerous. Black needs to try and regather it. e5 threatens this pawn on f6 again. If it was taken, then takes, and then queen e3. It's very, very difficult to sort of keep hold of all the pawns. There's just far too many weaknesses. If the queens get swapped off, then this a pawn is going to be very, very strong, quite difficult to prevent it from sort of going forwards. If here, then this pawn is going to queen after this fork. Okay. f5, c4 again is on the theme of creating a square for a knight. So now he'd love to be able to play knight b3, attacking this pawn, defending this one, and sort of pressuring the center. However, bishop takes on e5. Black has regained his pawn and is probably equal. So this c4 move is actually aimed at creating this b3 square for the knight, and the knight will be fantastic on b3, doing lots of sort of attacking, defending all at the same time. So after takes, knight b3, now the bishop cannot take this knight. The knight is doing a great job at defending this potentially game-winning pawn on a5, while simultaneously attacking the pawn on c5. Abasov can't just sit and wait now. A few moves for White, he'd consolidate this sort of extra pawn and then activate his pieces. He's a little bit awkward at the moment, especially this rook on f4. So he needs to do something. So he tried g5. It got pinned to the king, while simultaneously sort of allowing the rook to drop back, and the queen potentially can guard this pawn on e5 in the future. h6 was a bit of a mistake, but the defense for black in this position is very, very difficult to see. He needs to stay active. He can't be passive even for a single move, or he's going to fall. He's going to be at a major disadvantage. So king h8 is what is needed to play. And following this rook retreat, you needed to stay active, take the pawn back, and then sack another pawn on g4. The idea is he needs to open this king up. The queen is forced to defend this knight, and therefore the only way to take this pawn is with your own pawn. And then after takes, queen check, you sort of regather this pawn on g4, and then white's king is sort of too open for you to maintain your advantage. This is kind of his last chance. Difficult to see in time trouble. He sort of thought, right, I'll just protect my g5 pawn. And now when the rook retreats and this is taken, this king is just far too weak. There's no option now to go g4 because it can be taken with check. And after takes, this pawn on a5 is sort of used as a distraction. When black takes it, white switches his attention to the king side that is completely ripped wide open, and everything is coming in on f7. So the game is basically over now. There's no way of defending against against white coming in. I sort of to people I teach, I sort of say it like a bit of a football game. We have the same number of players on both sides of the pitch, so you know both sides have got 2 rooks, a queen, and 3 pawns each. However, all of black's defenders are all on one side of the board, and white quickly switches his attention over to this side, where it's sort of like a 3-on-1 situation. You've got this one queen defending the king, but the queen and both rooks are coming in at the same time. So even if you've got the same amount of pieces on the board, if all yours are on one side of the board, then you know it's a bit like on a football pitch where you've got, say, a 4v1 situation where you know the one goalkeeper is not going to be stopping like 3 or 4 defenders from scoring a goal. And that's what happens here. The king retreats, rook f7, and the queen is going to be sort of coming in now with checkmate. Yeah, if here, queen here, and there's nothing really going to be stopping these from checkmating this king. Okay, so the theme of the game was largely bishop v knight. So in this case, the knights were better than the bishops, and that's because Fabi managed to create squares for his knights. If he just sat there, didn't do anything, wasn't creative, weren't making squares for these knights, the bishop would have been better in the end game. But he successfully managed it and won a really nice game. I hope you enjoyed. If you found it useful, please like, share, and tell all your friends about it. Thank you very much. I'll see you for the next video.